this video we will discuss about skull. The skull is the bony framework of the head. It is arranged in two parts. One is known as the cranium. This is also called calvaria. The second is known as the facial skeleton. These two collectively form skull. Cranium, it comprises of 8 bones. Facial skeletal, it comprises of 14 bones. Now let's discuss about the cranium. It has one occipital bone. This bone lies at the back of cranium. Then we have two parietal bones. It forms roof of the skull. We have two temporal bones. It forms sides of the skull. One temporal bone is present on the right side and one on the left side. The front bone, which is known as the frontal bone, it forms forehead, interior region of our orbital cavity. Then we have ethmoidal bone and we have one sphenoid bone. So collectively we have 8 bones which forms the roof of our skull. It has one occipital which lies at the back, two parietal which forms the roof, two temporal which forms the sides of the skull, one frontal, one ethmoidal and one sphenoidal bone. This is the model of the skull. Now we will discuss these bones according to this model. First, as I have mentioned, we have an occipital bone which lies at the back of the cranium. See, this is the occipital bone. This is the occipital bone. It lies at the back of the skull and this is known as this occipital bone. Two parietal bones, see these two side bones. This is known as parietal bone. Two temporal bones, see these sides, this is known as the temporal bone. See this also, temporal bone. Two temporal bone. And we have a one frontal bone, a big bone which forms the forehead and interior region of our orbital cavity. So this whole bone is known as the orbital bone. This is an orbital bone. These two side bones is known as one right and one left. These are known as parietal bone. This one bone which is present at the back, this is known as occipital. These two side bones, these are known as temporal bone. Then we have ethmoidal and sphenoidal. See, this is the ethmoidal bone and this is the sphenoidal bone. So collectively we have 8 bones which forms our cranium. One frontal, two parietal, one occipital, two temporal, one ethmoidal and one sphenoidal. Now sutures. The sutures of the cranium. The bone of the skulls, these are joined by the immovable joint which is known as the suture. So now we will discuss about the sutures of this cranium. We have total 3 sutures, 3 main important sutures. The coronal suture. Number 2, we have a sagittal suture. And third, we have a lambdoid suture. These 3 forms the immovable joint of the skull called suture. According to this skull, joint, this immovable joint, which is present between the frontal and two parietal bone, this immovable joint is called coronal suture. Now the sagittal suture. This suture is present between these two parietal bones. So this suture, this immovable joint is called sagittal suture. And the third, the most important, the occipital bone, and between these two parietal bone we have another suture, another movable joint. This is called lambdoid suture. So these sutures are basically the immovable joint which is present between the bone. We have discussed about the coronal suture which is present between the frontal and two parietal bone. A sagittal suture which is present between these two parietal bones, and a lambdoidal suture which is present between the occipital and two parietal bones. So these immovable joint is known as the sutures. Fontanelle. So in infants, basically the bones are not completely ossified. So between the junction of the bone there lies a membranous region which is called the fontanelle. In infants we have two types of fontanelle. We have an anterior fontanelle and we have a posterior fontanelle. The anterior fontanelle, it lies in the front. It lies in the front and it is formed by the junction of coronal suture and sagittal suture. It is diamond in shape and it closes at 18 months. Now the posterior fontanelle. Posterior fontanelle. It lies at the back. It closes immediately after birth. It is formed by the junction of lambdoidal and sagittal suture. So, what is fontanelle? The bones of an infant are not completely ossified. So the junction of the bone, in between the junction of the bone, we have a membranous region. This membranous region is known as fontanelle. We have discussed two important fontanelles, the anterior fontanelle and the posterior fontanelle. The anterior fontanelle is formed by the junction of coronal suture and the sagittal suture. It is diamond in shape and it closes at 18 months. Then we discussed about the posterior fontanelle. The posterior fontanelle, it lies at the back. It closes immediately after birth. It is formed by the junction of lambdoidal suture and sagittal suture. Now according to this model, in the front there is present a frontal suture. This is diamond in shape and it is formed by the junction of, you can see these two coronal suture, and one sagittal suture, and there is also frontal suture. So it is formed by the junction of four bones, two sides coronal sutures, one frontal and one posteriorly which lies the parietal, which is also known as sagittal suture. So this anterior fontanelle is formed by the junction of four sutures, the frontal, two coronal and one sagittal. At the back lies the posterior fontanelle. This is formed by the junction of three sutures, two side by the lambdoidal sutures and one sagittal suture. So this is called the posterior suture, posterior fontanelle, and this is called the anterior fontanelle. This closes at 18 months and this closes at 6 weeks, around like after the birth of after the birth of the baby. It closes around 6 weeks. You can see as compared to this that it closes immediately after birth, or hardly takes 6 weeks, and this closes at 18 months.